We start this hour with the United States, which is poised to impose tough tariffs on nations still doing business with Russia 3 years after the Russia-Ukraine conflict began. Senator Lindsey says US President Donald Trump has thrown his support behind a bill that would slap a 500% tariff on imports from countries like India and China that continue buying Russian goods. Speaking to media, Graham said Trump encouraged him to bring the bill to a vote after the July break. The bill, which has already gained 84 co-sponsors, is designed to pressure countries to stop purchasing Russian oil, a move meant to undercut President Vladimir Putin's war economy and force him to negotiate. Graham stated that India and China purchase 70% of Putin's oil. They're keeping his war machine running. This bill gives the US president the power to respond with tariffs, and Trump supposedly supports it. The bill, first introduced in March, was held up due to White House resistance to expanding sanctions. But with shifting views in Washington, it is now expected to be tabled in August. If enacted, the legislation could hit India hard. As the world's third largest oil importer, India buys around 5.1 million barrels of crude daily, much of it from Russia, and refines it into petrol and diesel. Well, joining us on the programme to discuss the potential ramifications, not just for Russia, but also other countries that buy their oil, is Ross Feingold, a political analyst who is joining us from Taipei. Ross, as always, thank you ever so much for being here with us. I'm going to ask you a two-pronged question here. Of course, we've heard about this potential sanction on third parties that buy Russian oil from the US for a while. One, why do you think this shift has happened? And two, how devastating could the impact be on a Russian economy that is also ongoing in a war?
Well, there are a number of people in the U.S. Congress, both in the Senate and the House, who've been very strong supporters of Ukraine throughout the last 3 years of Russia's invasion. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina is one of those senators, and he's trying to push this bill into law. So it comes as no surprise that he's leading the effort. He's been very outspoken in his support for Ukraine. And although there's certainly some members of the U.S. Congress who have a more Trump kind of view, which is skepticism towards aiding Ukraine. And President Trump himself, obviously, he's made a lot of effort to try and bring about a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia, although so far unsuccessfully. But the desire to support Ukraine still exists in the U.S. Congress, and that's why members of Congress have come forward with this proposal. Now, have to keep in mind that the wording, if it does pass, will probably include broad language that allows the President of the United States to waive those tariffs if the President deems it to be in the interest of the United States. So it's easy for President Trump to say that he supports this bill because it could pass and he could sign it into law, and then he could still waive those 500% tariffs if he thinks it's necessary to do so. Obviously, to get to the second part of your question, if the United States was to impose 500% tariffs on trading partners like India or China, it would be devastating on those countries, and those countries would have no choice but to stop buying oil and energy from Russia. And if they stop buying energy from Russia, then Russia is going to lose one of its main sources of income at the moment, and it could devastate their war effort.
On this topic for a moment, and first of all, I want to look at the global impact. Of course, we've seen Trump's tariffs and Trump's levies have huge impacts on global markets, on global businesses. What would a tariff of this extremity on a commodity like oil that is so vital to so much infrastructure and normal everyday life, what impact would that have on the global economic scale?
That's a really good question, but I don't think we really know the answer. There are obviously alternative sources of oil. President Trump could put pressure on countries like Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries to increase production in order to avoid any price increase that might occur if India and China were to stop buying Russian oil. So that's a bit of an unknown at the moment, but there are possible solutions. But certainly, again, I think the key point here is not what might happen to the price of oil. It really is what would happen if Russia was cut off from the financial flows, from the income that it gets from China and India, which still buy its oil.
Yes, and Ross, finally on this topic, we've seen Trump's posturing, Trump's rhetoric being used to try and get people to the negotiating table? Is this directly a push towards Russia agreeing to a ceasefire in the war with Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. If this does pass and passes the Congress and President Trump signs it into law, it will be a very new and possibly effective tool that President Trump could have to persuade Russia and Ukraine to reach a ceasefire. We know that President Trump has been actively trying to get a ceasefire throughout his term in office since January of this year. He's failed at that so far. It's clearly frustrated him, and he's made that clear publicly in some of his comments. Sometimes his comments are directed at Russia, and sometimes his comments are directed at Ukraine. But the interesting thing here is, if we game this out, if this becomes law, and President Trump could waive it as part of a ceasefire arrangement, then Russia is also going to be asking for other types of sanctions to be removed. So what comes to mind here is the possibility of a broader deal, but at its heart would have to be a ceasefire.
Yes, Ross, stay with us as we stay with President Donald Trump, who says he will not succeed